This is the swing out bumper that I built for my Nissan Frontier last year. I already have a video about this bumper that walks through everything I did, how everything works. I did not really share the build process in that video. I did promise that I would eventually go back and put together all of the video that I shot in the process of building this, and that's what this video is. Now, if you're just looking at bumpers and want ideas, I would recommend watching the other video that I already made about this. I will put a link to that in the description below. This is already a very long video, and I'm just going to let you come along for the actual build process, more of a vlog than anything else. Now, this is not a how-to video. I'm not going to explain to you how to build something like this. I'm not qualified to do that. And if you watch this video, you will see. In fact, you will see many of the mistakes that I made. I've shared them in this video. Things that I did wrong, things that I didn't think through, things that just went wrong in one way or another. I've included all of that in this video. Now, I am not a skilled or experienced welder, and I built this using an inexpensive flux core welder. So the welds on this are not pretty. And I'm not here to say that what I've done here is good or should be replicated or anything like that. I'm just sharing the process that I went through so that any of you who are novice welders may be considering taking on a project like this. You know, here's what I went through using inexpensive equipment. You will see that the welds are not pretty. I did the best that I could with the equipment that I had. It was just not possible for me to upgrade to, you know, a higher end welder. Even though I'm not a particularly skilled welder and I made a lot of mistakes on this project. This has been on the truck for several months. It's been trail tested. It's been all around Oregon and beyond in the West. It's been down some pretty rough trails. It is holding up fine. It's functioning the way I intended it to function. It's not a thing of beauty, but it seems to be working okay. Now, I drew a lot of inspiration and information from the YouTube channel Overland Under Budget. Micah has built a number of bumpers like this, and he's got some really good videos on his channel. I referred to them over and over and over again when I was building mine and figuring out what I needed to do, what I needed to get. So if you are looking to DIY your own bumper, definitely go check out Overland Under Budget.
First, I need to get the stock bumper off the truck. I'm starting by removing things like the license plate lights, the trailer wiring plug, and these aftermarket auxiliary backup lights a previous owner had installed.
So the second gen bumper bolts on just with these 3 bolts onto the frame rails, and then on each side, and then this whole thing comes off.
But of course it's not that simple. The bolts are really frozen on there, and my impact wrench isn't budging them. I carry a long breaker bar in case I need to change a tire, but of course the bumper bolts are different from the lug nuts, so I had to buy a new 1/2-inch drive socket just for the bumper bolts. I've also drenched the bolts with PB Blaster a number of times and given it time to penetrate.
Broke loose.
One final bolt is being more stubborn than the others, so I'm using a piece of unistrut as a cheater pipe for more leverage.
I wasn't sure I was going to get that 6th bolt loose. I had just tried everything and I hit it with more blaster and let it sit for another 15-20 minutes. Finally got it. Just had to just persevere.
Charlie is occasionally inspecting the progress. I'm removing the plastic cover to access the bolts that hold the outer shell of the factory bumper onto the frame brackets and crash beam. I'll explain why I'm disassembling all this in just a moment.
One of the things that I was a little bit intimidated about by doing a rear bumper was just fabricating the brackets that would bolt the bumper to the truck. You know, it requires a certain amount of precision, and while I've done, you know, some welding before, it seems like I make enough mistakes that I don't have a lot of confidence in my ability to be super precise. And it occurred to me that my existing rear bumper has brackets that are made for the truck, and What's more is that this sort of crash beam piece in the middle, I think this is really the structural part of the bumper. It holds these two brackets perfectly in position. Now I had this idea that could I just use this rather than making whole new brackets? So my idea is I'm going to fit my new bumper tube to these brackets right here. Once I know that I've got that together and everything positioned perfectly, then I can cut out this piece and everything will be perfectly positioned to go right back on the truck. That's the idea.
The backbone of my bumper will be this 3" by 5" tube with 1/8" thick walls, which I found in the scrap and remnant area of the steel yard for about $50. It has been somewhat exposed to the Western Oregon humidity for who knows how long and needs some cleanup work.
So I remounted this piece back on here just so that I can start to figure out where my tube needs to go and where I will need to cut so I can weld it onto these brackets. You can see how nice and beefy those are. There's actually some extra reinforcing in there. I feel much better about using those than making something of my own. So I don't want to get too close to the tailgate. I'm thinking if I could just use this right here as where that tube mounts, and I will cut that, and so then it would come out 3 inches further. It's about like that. So basically would be there. It sticks out about as far as the stock bumper stuck out. Then if the hinge is here, the swing out arm is here, I still need this space to be able to, yeah, I mean, I don't think I want it any closer than that. And this gives me, you know, sort of a built-in precision. I know that it's square to the truck. If I mount it to the bottom of these, then I know that it's level this way. I think that's what I'm going to do.
I just need to cut a little notch out of those brackets to make that work.
So I am going to mark where that frame member hits so that I can cut holes for this 1/4 inch bar, which is just a scrap that I found when I was looking for stuff. And I'm going to use this to attach to the recovery points and bring them through the bumper and welded to the brackets here that are bolted to the frame, so the recovery points are not just mounted on the surface of the tube. And I would never have thought of that, but that's what Micah did with his, and I thought that was a good idea.
These are the holes I need to cut out for those recovery point tongues to pass through the bumper tube, but I can only go so far plunging the cutoff wheel into the surface, so I'm going to see if I can finish this off with the drill press.
Well, I made kind of a mess of the first hole here. The second one I did went better because I punched holes with the drill press at each end, and I was able to be a little bit more precise. I got to do 2 more on the other side for this bar to pass through. Before I project those lines around, let's just make sure. Okay, that's going through. And contact with the frame. That's going through in contact with the frame. Okay. So I've just used the speed square to project that line around what will be the front of the bumper. Okay, that one came out much cleaner. And we got everything nice and aligned. That bar goes right through. I got one more to cut over there.
I'm now ready to weld the tube onto the brackets, but first I need to remove the paint where the welds will be. I find a flap disc works well for this. I'm using a wire wheel on the bare metal of the tube to fully remove any scale and rust residue at the spot of the weld. First, I'm just making some tack welds to hold everything together. Before I fully weld this up, I want to just double check it all looks right on the truck. Obviously, these are going to get cut shorter, and that gap there, you know, will be hidden by the actual swing arm, but I'm thinking I may actually deck the top of this the way Micah did on his. So I'm just looking at how far this stands out. Unfortunately, I don't have the material yet for the actual swing arm, and I'm thinking about using 2x2 tubes, so it'll be slightly narrower than that. This tailgate kind of bows out. It's not perfectly flat. It's got to curve out, so there's more space. There's more space here than there is here. And it would be complicated to try and move this, you know, a ½ inch closer. I think I'm going to call that good. I wasn't originally planning to deck the top of the bumper, but I think I may do that. I think that's going to look a lot cleaner. And just to confirm, these still looking good. Yeah. Yes. Excellent. So what I'm doing at this point is actually I'm going to finish welding the tube onto these brackets so I can cut this other piece off and make this a little easier to manage. Well, this welding isn't going to win any beauty pageants, but it is much, much better than I was doing on the front bumper with the little welder. Okay, now with the tube solidly welded onto those brackets, this tube is now keeping these brackets in place, so I can cut off this sort of crash beam part of the old original bumper. I'm ready to start working on these recovery points, but rather than just weld those to the surface of the bumper, I'm following Micah's approach of also adding tongues that pass through the bumper tube. And rather than just butt welding that on there, I'm carving out a channel for that tongue to set into and form a stronger joint. I would not have thought of this myself. I'm again following Micah's lead on that.
Okay, now that I've got these tongues cut, I am going to just tack them in to the recovery points and test fit them before I do the full welds on that.
All right, I'm happy with how those are fitting in there. I might have to make these holes just a little bit bigger to accommodate the welds and say weld those on. Those look good, so I think I'm going to finish weld those.
So now I'm just getting these sort of clamped into place and making sure that everything looks lined up, parallel, and whatever. All right, that took me a while, but I've got the recovery points all welded on, including the tongues that go down and are welded onto the brackets. It's not pretty, but I think it's solid. So now let's put this on the truck, and then we can figure out where we're going to cut the length to fit. Okay, so you can see how that end needs to kind of get cut off, and that end kind of needs to get cut off. Just got to figure out where.
Okay, before I get too carried away with figuring that out, I better make sure that I've actually got space for the swing out hinge, because it's got to make sure that it clears the tailgate when the tailgate drops. In fact, let's drop that tailgate. Oh yeah. spindle in there. So I haven't actually bought the tubing that I'm going to use for the swing arm, but so I'll just use this as a stand-in. I got to make sure that it's going to clear the edge of the tailgate here. I want it close, but I don't want it so close where if I make a mistake, I can't get the tailgate open and closed. No, I think it's fine where it's at, but I'm going to nudge it out a little further just to give myself a little margin of error, because I tend to make errors. If that's cut off like that. Yeah, this piece of metal was couldn't really have been any shorter. Okay, after fiddling around with it for a while, there's sort of what I've settled on. I don't know if you can see that. I think that follows the contour of the truck pretty well. Now I could cut this off with the angle grinder, but obviously I have to cap this end off once I get it cut. And if I don't get those cuts perfectly and anything is a little bit askew, it's going to be really hard to cut that piece that is going to cover that. So I think what I'm going to do is run to the hardware store and see if I can get a steel cutting blade for the saw. I know those are expensive and I didn't want to go to that extra expense, but I think between cutting this and also cutting the pieces for the swing arm, and there's various angles, and that all needs to fit together really nicely. I think ultimately I will be happy that I made the investment, because it may save me a lot of frustration. Well, I was thinking $50, it was actually $70. I hope that proves to be worth it. That really brings the cost of this project up considerably. I could also get like an abrasive wheel, like on the cutoff wheel, like on the grinder, and those were like $7. But I did some reading real quick, and everyone says you're going to be much happier with this.
Something here is preventing me from cutting all the way through.
It's the motor running into this bracket. And if I swing this the other way, recovery point runs into this. See, this is why you don't watch my channel to learn how to do something, because I'm an idiot. Every single way I try to get this onto the saw, there's some piece of something that runs into the base of the saw, the motor of the saw. It can't be done. And when I was at the store, I almost bought a steel cutting blade just for my circular saw. Had I done that, I would have been able to cut this. I would have been done. I would have moved on to the next thing by now. I thought it would be nice to be able to be more precise. I did not think about everything that I was going to run into here. Now, had I cut this in advance before doing all of this work, it also would have been no problem. But I did not want to cut this because I was worried about making some other mistake at some point, and then, you know, having wasted the material. Instead, I've now started using the $70 saw blade that I'm not going to be able to return, and it actually isn't going to work for me for this. I'm going to have to just use the grinder and do it by hand. This will come in nicely for the tube for the swing arm, and that's where I really am going to need even more precision than what I'm doing here.
So I am cutting the ends of the bumper tube by hand after all. I have to head down to Ventura, California in a couple of days to get my new Topo Toppers camper. I'm putting on a light coat of paint so I can have some kind of bumper on the truck for the trip. I'll just have to grind some of that paint back off where further welding is still needed.
Over the span of the last several weeks, I've gone back numerous times to the steel yard looking through the scrap and remnants, hoping to find the tubing that I need to make the swing arm. I never found what I needed. I eventually had to give up and just have them cut me some new pieces. They charge $1 or $2 per cut, but it was easier to just have them cut the 14 feet that I needed into manageable pieces. Because I had to buy this new, this ended up being more money than I hoped. It was about $100 for all of the 1/8 inch wall, 2-inch tubing that was going to make the swing arm. I got more than I needed here. One of these pieces will form the lower arm, but I gave myself a lot of room for error there. And same thing, one piece will become diagonal, but I'm not quite sure exactly how far across that will go. So I just had them cut me 2 6-foot pieces plus a 2-foot piece, which is again more than I need, but to make the vertical part of the swing arm there.
I'll need a hole in the bumper tube to accommodate the large nut on the bottom of the hinge assembly. I'm cutting a scrap of C-channel, which I'm going to weld inside the tube for extra strength at the hinge end. I'm trying to clean up the metal inside as well as I can. I don't know if this is necessary, but I figure it can't hurt to add a little extra bracing where the tube will be most stressed.
Now the way Micah built his bumper, he welded the nut that holds the bottom of the hinge spindle right into the metal like that. Because I'm using a little bit thinner material, and also because I just don't trust my ability to get that welded in there perfectly flat. If it's skewed off at all, that's going to impact, how this fits together. So I am actually going to weld this nut right onto the bottom of this whole thing. This way, this is much heavier metal than what this is, and it's closer to the thickness of what the nut is. That way I know 100% for sure that this bolt is going to fit down through there and into that nut no matter what. And then I will weld that whole construction onto the bumper itself. So I made this hole a little bigger than it needs to be to allow room for the welds that will be around there. I'm going to just tack it on for now and then make sure that the bolt is working just fine before I complete the welds. And I'm leaving this bolt in place both to hold it there and also to keep spatter from the welding from getting into the threads of the nut. Guess I should also just make sure, 100% sure, that everything is, I haven't made any mistakes here. That looks good. Fits right in there. Okay.
Now I'm ready to fully weld that nut onto the bottom of the hinge assembly.
Well, it is not beautiful, but it is definitely on there. It's not going anywhere. And yeah, I could see it like melting right through that nut. And even though I'm running on 110, I'm definitely getting decent penetration through there. And I'm pretty sure that's 5/16 inch steel. And the bolt still works. So that's the most important. Now, I don't know if with all that weld on there, that's still going to fit in there, if I may have to grind a little bit off. Let's see how that looks. Oh, I think that's pretty good.
Even new steel like this can have oils and mill scale that need to be cleaned off, so impurities are not introduced into the weld.
So I'm going to just tack this on first, and I'm using these magnets to make sure that I am good and flush and hold it into place. Oh, and I almost forgot. These little holes here hold down a stainless steel plate that sits here so that the swing arm doesn't, grind your paint off. But we definitely want to plug those holes with those screws so that we don't get weld splatter up inside them, plus they're really finely threaded, so we don't want to take any chances with that. I know you see my cat around in the garage sometimes when I'm out here working. I do lock him back in the house when I'm welding, so there's no chance of him actually looking at the welding and damaging his eyes. When I'm not welding, I let him back out because he just sits at the door and cries. He just loves to be out here when I'm out here. All right, now I've got this hinge fully welded on, and I think I'm ready to start looking at capping those ends.
I'm cutting the end pieces out of a scrap of 1/8" metal plate I had sitting around. I've now got the ends welded on, and I'm grinding the corners smooth.
Okay, well, I'm pretty happy with how that's turning out. Just sort of all turns into one unit. Now, the big mistake that I made is I had these screws in here to protect the threads, but I didn't realize that the hole of this screw really comes out where this weld is, and I think I've melted that screw right into place. So I think I'm going to have to cut that off and drill a new hole to put a screw in there. But that's not too major. Yeah.
Again, emulating Micah's techniques, I'm adding a reinforcing bar of 1/4" steel along the back of the hinge and bumper for even more added strength.
Okay, so here's where we're at this morning. I've got the ends of the bumper capped off. I'm happy with how that turned out. I've got the hinge on there solidly. So the next problem I've encountered here is that this hinge piece has clearly warped just a bit with the heat of the welding. Before I welded this on here, this bolt would go through the hole and into the nut, no problem at all. And now, I don't know if you can see that, it is just slightly off center now. So when it goes into that nut, there's a lot of resistance. It's really feels wrong. It's coming in at a slight angle. And I did keep this bolt in place when I did all of this welding, so with the thought that it would keep things more stable. But it definitely, I barely was able to get this bolt back out of there. It had tightened up so much. So, yeah, see, it's like, looks like it wants to go in. I mean, it's a couple of millimeters, but it's enough. So, I mean, I feel like that this was not my mistake. I definitely made some mistakes on this, but I feel like I did everything as right as I could possibly do here. I think what I'm probably going to do is try to enlarge this hole slightly on this side so that bolt is over just a bit. There's still going to be plenty of metal there for that to grab onto. There's also a washer that sits right here normally. So I think that'll be fine. I think the challenge is just going to be to try and make that hole a little bigger. All I have is this old grinding bit that I used for some other project. I don't remember what. I think it's kind of worn down. I don't know if I can maybe take some of that off. These things wear down really fast, and this is a lot of metal. All right, well, I wore that grinding bit down to the point where it was like, it was done. And I did actually change the shape of the hole more than I expected. I kept checking it with the bolt to see where it was hitting, and it was mostly hitting on this side edge and this front edge. So I kind of tried to work the hole in that direction. It's definitely going in much nicer.
Once again, I picked up this technique from Micah for cutting a curved notch to fit the swing arm onto the hinge spindle. After cutting out all the little tines, I cleaned up the cut with a grinder. I'm quite pleased with that fit. Again, prepping the metal for welding. I'm tacking this together on the truck so I know the arm is positioned perfectly parallel to the lower bumper. After confirming it all looks good, I've taken it back off the truck to complete the full welds.
All right, so that is working really well. I'm happy that I'm this far and it is actually functioning. So I next have to figure out how I'm going to incorporate the latch here. I'm actually using a scrap of this that I cut off, and the silver bit there would be the metal that will keep, and everything else will get cut away. And this space here will capture the arm, and I'll weld some kind of a cap on top of that, and then the latch could either go on top or on the side.
I had the idea to look for metal cutting blades for the jigsaw, and it's proven useful for tight corners where the round cutoff disc won't fit. I wish I had thought of this before when I was cutting those narrow slots in the bumper tube. With that piece made, I can now figure out the final length of the swing arm.
All right, now that I've got this tacked into place and confirmed that this is all working just fine, now this can all come off the truck. I can do all the finish welding. So notice this piece of tube, once it was sort of cut apart, it wanted to kind of squeeze itself in and not stay square. So that's why I cut this little piece of wood to jam in there and just hold everything in place. Oh, that was horrible. That was just awful. All right, with that all welded on there, I'm gonna make a cap out of the same thickness, the 1/8" metal, to put on top, and that will give me a place to mount the latch.
That's now all welded, and after some cleanup, I'm ready for an inspection.
I've capped off the end of the lower portion of the swing arm. So now we can work on, I think, getting the latch set up. And I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with how tidily that fits together there. The mistake I did make, though, is that I cut this notch too deep. And really, I needed it to come only like right to there so that this would be pushed up against it when the latch is latched down. Currently, that leaves some play in there. So I think I'm going to add a piece of something. I've got this angle that I think I could weld up in there, and it would actually sort of reinforce the whole thing.
Here's the piece I made to fix that problem.
Well, I had to go buy new gloves this morning. Same as these old ones that I've had for years. These gloves have been great. Yesterday, in a moment of inattention, I somehow managed to run the side of my finger alongside the grinder while I was running. And it just like sheared through all of the stitching. And now I'm no longer protected. But if I hadn't been wearing gloves, that would have been my skin. Okay, so now that fits in there nice and flush. Now this latch is some kind of galvanized metal, and my understanding is that you shouldn't weld on galvanized metal because it releases some pretty toxic gases. So I am grinding off the coating. I don't know if you can see the difference there. I ground off the coating on the left side down to bare metal where I'll be doing any welding. And I'll leave the galvanized on here. So I'll have to paint over the bare metal. Okay, so I've got the handle part of the latch all welded on to the swing arm. This latch is designed normally to be bolted on. It had a couple of holes in it like that. I actually completely filled them in just to give it sort of more of a seamless look. Now we need to attach this piece up here. Well, to my astonishment, that all actually works. So as I mentioned before, I coughed up like 70 bucks to get this steel cutting blade so I can make some more precise cuts. And it's true that worked really well, but for a disturbingly short amount of time. After not nearly as many cuts as I would have hoped, this thing just stopped being effective at all. It just stopped moving through the metal and it was just burning its way through. I went this direction because I did some reading online, and the consensus among experienced metal workers seemed to be that using an abrasive type cutoff wheel on a saw like this, ultimately it was just messy and not as effective as using one of these blades. The 10-inch cutoff wheel that will fit this saw, this was like $6 something. It was less than $7. This was $70. And even if I have to go through 2 or 3 of these, I'm sure I can get a lot more cuts for my money than I did with this blade. So for the jerry can support, I'm using this 2-inch, 1/8-inch angle. And so ignore this, this is just holding things up. So I'm using this sort of coping method to create these joints rather than doing them mitered. That gives me sort of more places to weld, and by all accounts seems to be a stronger joint. So first I'm going to get these first 2 pieces, make sure they're square, and then tack that in place. So this is something I picked up from multiple videos on YouTube. I've just tacked on a piece of scrap here to hold everything in place so that when I make all of these welds and the heat wants to move this a little bit, these pieces won't be able to move and so everything will stay square. And then I'll just cut that off and smooth that back down.
I'm going to step away from the swing arm for a moment and work on this decking. I got really lucky finding this scrap of diamond plate that happened to be just the right width, so I don't need to cut the entire length of it. I just needed to make some notches in a few places, and I've cleaned up the areas that will get welded. I also need to take the paint off the bumper tube where that diamond plate will get welded on. I've decided to fully weld the entire length, but I have to do it in about 6-inch segments to not overheat the welder. I think once this is all painted, it'll look decent enough. Yes, I'm actually quite happy with how that turned out.
Well, we're yet another day into this project out of I don't know how many days. I've been focused more on working on this than actually filming, so I'll try and kind of catch up here a little bit. I pretty much got the holder done for the jerry cans, all completely put together and welded onto the swing arm. I just now need to figure out a way to secure these on here, both to keep them from bouncing out
and also just to lock them so, you know, they don't walk away.
This is 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch electrical conduit, which some of you may recognize as components of the DIY awning on my Forester years ago. The way these nest so neatly has given me an idea. I've cut a couple of short pieces of the 3/4 inch conduit. I'm going to cap the end of one of them.
Now, don't forget that galvanized metal has coating on it that makes a toxic gas when you weld on it. So if you're going to use galvanized metal like this, you want to grind all that galvanization off and just get it back down to bare steel. Now, I should have thought to do that before I cut that little piece out. Would have been much easier. This, by the way, is my mini welding table that I made out of scraps that I found, again, at the steel yard, just a piece of steel. It was just this size, and I put these tiny little legs on it. I'll show you why in a minute. So trying to weld a small part like this would be difficult to clamp. And again, had I thought, I would have actually done all of this before I even cut this off. I could have welded this cap on and then cut the thing off, and the whole thing would have been easier to manipulate, but I didn't think of doing that. So this allows me to clamp the ground clamp onto this piece of metal, and then this can sit right there on the metal and the current will go through, and I will just tack that on there like that. So the other way I use this is this sort of workbench thing that was here in the garage when I moved into this house. Actually cut little holes for the legs, so this most of the time sits down in there, and it just gives me a surface that I can weld on also, that protects the wood. And when I need to set something on and clamp onto it, then I just lift it out and set it up on top of this. All right, so that is not pretty, and I knew it wouldn't be, but the idea was just to get that cap welded on there well, and I will just grind that down to make it look nicer. All right, finished up. Tried just to make that look like it was one solid piece of metal.
In the other short piece of 3/4 inch conduit, I'm drilling holes for the shank of a padlock to pass through. I capped both ends of a piece of the 1/2 inch conduit, and now I'm cleaning up those welds.
And I could have just left that piece of pipe as it was, but I felt like I wanted to go ahead and cap the ends so it was more like a solid rod, and then nothing can get inside of there.
So the rod of 1/2 inch conduit slides through the 3/4 inch conduit and is captured by the capped conduit on one side, and the padlock on the other side keeps it from being removed. This will both hold the jerry cans in place on the trail and discourage casual theft. I'm making some brackets which I will weld onto the swing arm.
So here is the support for the toolbox. This is the 2" by 2" angle. It's 1/8 inch thick. And I made 3 of those. And I also made these tabs on the back so the toolbox can emerge out slightly. Well, that is another mistake. I liked the idea of part of the weight of the box resting on the actual swing arm as opposed to being completely hanging off the front of it. And so I made those little tabs so, you know, they would sort of pull the weight of the box backwards instead of having it all hanging out this way. And I did test, before I made those, I tested that if this was on there and lined up with those, it fits. And I thought I tested the lid opening as well, but it actually doesn't work. I'm running into the tailgate. So I decided to add these tabs sort of going vertically off the back of the arm so I could still secure the toolbox sort of on the back side here and give it some pull in this direction, so it's not just relying on the braces underneath. And I was going to cut these original tabs off, but then I thought, well, I might as well leave them. Maybe at some point down the road, there'll be something I want to mount back here. Now, why are all of the propane bottle holders that you find, that you can buy, they're always like open in the front? They're just like metal that goes around the sides and something that supports them from the bottom, and then always some kind of strap, and never anything that sort of encapsulate it more. I don't know if there's a reason for that. I can't think of what it is. It seems like it's just less secure than if you just went ahead and finished off the box. I don't get it. If you know why the propane mounts are always like that, I mean, comment below. So, you know, maybe there's a reason, so I've sort of emulated that. I did feel like I didn't want to trust just the quick fist strap, even though they're rated for much more weight than this, and you know, they're very well reviewed. They seem to work just fine. I did have some scrap of this expanded steel. I just bent it around the bottle and cut out a strip so that I can put that in here. I feel better about having something metal sort of enclosing it out the back, but it's still sort of open like all of the other ones.
These holes are for the quick fist strap to bolt onto. I'm cutting a little piece of the 2-inch tubing to create a sleeve that will receive the removable propane bottle mount. This will make sense in just a moment.
So there's the carrier for the propane tank, minus the quick fist straps. And the idea is that will slip right down into those little channels, and then the latches will help hold them in place. So I know some of it's going to burn off, but I did pre-paint the inside of those little channels because I knew it was going to be difficult to get paint down in there. At least there's some protection. So these little latches, I'm just going to get these lined up on here. That will hold this on, and there is a little hole there so I can put a padlock in one of them so no one can walk away with the tank.
The swing arm itself is finally complete and ready for paint. I'm starting with a coat of self-etching primer before moving on to the black paint. The propane bottle mount is complete as well.
Okay, so I greased the bearings and inserted these dust shields, and that was kind of a tricky thing. I didn't really know what I was doing, how I was supposed to do it, and you'd push it on one side, it'd pop up in the other. But ultimately, I just kind of kept working my way around, tapping with the hammer and holding on the other side, and eventually it just got it worked in, and I can see how that does form a really nice seal there. And I really don't know anything about greasing bearings. I just oozed as much grease as I could into every place. I also put grease all on the inside of this because there's bare steel, and hopefully the grease will protect the metal.
I've also greased up the spring-loaded pin that locks the swing arm open.
Okay, so in theory, if I put this all together correctly, when this swings out, that little spindle will pop down into the first notch and lock it into place. Oh, yes. Pull that up. And it'll notch into the second one. And then pull it up. Let's just be sure we are still clearing here.
Last step is to bolt on the toolbox, and after 3 months of weekends and evenings, this project is finally done.
Most of the material on this bumper I found in the scrap area or remnant area of my local steel yard. The only new material I bought was the 2-inch by 2-inch, 1/8-inch thick wall tubing. A big part of the budget of this overall build was the hinge assembly and the latch. The hinge assembly was about $135. Now that included the entire encapsulating part of steel that was already formed to capture that hinge, as well as the tube in the middle, bearings top and bottom, the bolt that runs through, the nut that captures the bolt, and the pin that latches the arm when it's open. It's a really nicely made kit. It's much better than anything that I would have been able to put together myself. I did all the welding on the bumper using this Everlast Cyclone 200E. This is a welder that will do flux core or will run gas. I have not set this up with gas, and so I was running flux core. After doing some research, I heard a lot of good things about Fornay wire for flux core, and so when I ran out of the Harbor Freight wire that was in it when I got this, I replaced it with Fornay wire, and it worked noticeably better. 100% worth the additional expense. And this will do 110 or 220, but I don't have a 220 set up out here, so I did weld everything at 110. And I have had people call into question whether or not a 110 welder could get enough penetration to make strong enough welds for a project like this. I'm not welding 1/2-inch thick steel here. You know, it's 1/8 inch, 3/16, 1/4 inch steel. I had no issue getting plenty of penetration, and I could easily blow out the metal if I wasn't careful, if I had the settings wrong. I did run a little strength test using some 1/8 inch metal. Here's how that went. Okay, just testing the strength of those welds. So there is just 2 flat pieces of metal I just butt welded together, and the metal bent and the weld held. So that makes me feel like that's pretty strong. All right, that was a long haul. If you've watched this whole entire video, thank you for watching. If you want to get a closer look at the finished product, how all of this actually comes together and functions, and why I made some of the choices I made in designing this, definitely go watch the sort of walkthrough video. Again, I will put a link to that in the description below. And if you are looking for how-to advice, be sure to go and check out Overland Under Budget. Micah is just a wonderful teacher, and I couldn't have done this project without him. Comment below if you have any questions, and thank you for watching.